In this video we're going to discuss template fragments with HTMX and Django. Now when you're using HTMX you might have noticed that you often create a lot of HTML files for code that's specific to an HTMX response. In my previous videos I've referred to these as partials or partial templates, but one of the issues is if you have a large project, using HTMX in this way and creating all these templates can lead to an explosion in the number of templates. Now this template fragment idea is a way of decomposing a template into different blocks, and then you can include specific blocks in your responses without having to break the file up. And this can cut down on the number of templates that you use in a project. And in this video, we're going to see an implementation of this using django-render-block. This is a third-party package. We're going to see how to use that with HTMX to create these template fragments in this video. So let's get started. In VS Code, I have a project here. There's two dependencies, Django and Django extensions. And there will also be a starter project on GitHub if you want to follow along with this implementation. In this project, we have a very simple setup. We've got one URL, we have one view for that URL, and that view renders this template index.html. We're going to build this template up and we're going to use template fragments later on. For now, let's get started, and we're going to build a very basic setup for this video. It's going to contain a single model that we're going to build now, and I'm just going to paste the code for this model here. It's a book model that contains a name, which is a car field. Once you've done that, you can run python manage.py make migrations, and then you can run the migrate command to make the changes to the database. So we should now have a book table in the database. What we're going to do now is create a form that is going to be used on the front end. When we submit that form, we want to add a new book to our database. So we're going to create a class here called book form, and that's going to inherit from the forms.modelForm class. So we're going to inherit from modelForm, which means we define a meta class linking that model form to a model. Now the model we're going to link it to is going to be the book model, which we're going to import at the top. So underneath the forms import, from core.models we'll import book. And secondly, we're going to specify the fields that we want to render in the form from that model. In this case, it's the name field. That's the only field on the model anyway. Once we've written this code, we can save the file. And what we're going to do now is go to our views.py. And within this index view, we're going to create an instance of the book form and attach it to the context. So let's bring in a couple of imports at the top. Firstly, the book model from core.models and the book form as well from core.forms. Once you've got the imports, we're going to create a key in our context called form, and the value for that is going to be an instance of the book form. So we instantiate that book form. What we're now going to do is render that book form within the index.html. So let's go to that template. Now, because we're adding books, we're going to assume that this is a library system that we're dealing with. So I'm going to add a little bit of code at the top. It's a div wrapping an h1 tag, and the header is the library of Babel. And then there's some 𝗤𝗵𝗽𝗁 displayed below that with the 𝗤𝗵 template tag. Now underneath that we're going to do an hr tag to divide that content from the form below. And the section below is going to be the section for adding a book. So we have a div here with the ID of add form container. There's a header tag saying add book. And what we're going to do below that is we're going to create a form tag, and we're going to create a form that allows us to submit the book. Now we have that form in our context, so we're going to say form.asp, and that will render the form with paragraph tags separating the fields. And for now, we're also going to include the CSRF token in this form. And finally, below the form, we're going to create a submit button, and that'll allow us to submit that to the back end. So that's the basic setup. What we're going to do now is run the server, and we can see that on the front end, and then we're going to use HTMX to actually submit the form to the back end. So if we go to the page, this is what it looks like at the moment. We have the header at the top, we have some 𝗤𝗵𝗽𝗁 here, and then we have another section below that containing the form. Now at the moment we don't have a view to handle this submission. We're going to set that up in a second, but what we're going to do now is we're going to get HTMX into this project as a script tag. So let's go to the HTMX documentation here. I'll link this below the video. We have a CDN link here that we can grab and import into our project's base.html. So in the base.html, in the head tag, just below the title, we're going to paste that script tag, and that will bring HTMX into our project. Now if we go back to index.html, we're going to add HTMX attributes to the form element. First of all, let's add an hx post attribute, and that's going to be using the URL template tag in Django. And we're going to send the post request just to the index view, and that view is this one here. The URL will send the request to this view, so we need to handle the post request in this view. We'll write the code for that in a second. Let's go back to the form element, and we're going to set up an hx target here, and that determines where the returned HTML will be swapped into the DOM. And what I'm going to do when we submit the form, we're just going to return the container containing the form and that should then replace this form container within our document. So the hx target is going to be the add form container. That's an ID, so we need to use the hash. And the mechanism for swapping, we're going to say hx swap equals outer HTML. So to reiterate, the target is this div here with the add form container ID, and the swap mechanism is outer HTML. So we want to return a fragment containing all of this content, including the form. So when there's a successful submission, the form will be redisplayed with the fields emptied, and when there's any errors, the form will be redisplayed with those errors and the data from the original submission. So that's the HTMX attributes for the form. I'm going to remove the CSRF token because we're doing this via an AJAX request. We can remove that token, and what I'm going to do is go to base.html, and in the body tag, I'm going to replace that with a body tag that contains an hx headers attribute, and this attaches the CSRF token to the request. And this is the way it's recommended to be done in the Django HTMX documentation, so I'm just pasting that code from there. I'll link that in the description. Now once we've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the view, and we need to set this view up to handle a post request when the form is submitted. So we'll say if the request.method is equal to a post request, then we're going to create a variable called form. We're going to instantiate the book form with the data from the post request. After that, we're going to check if the form is valid using the form.isValid method. And because it's a model form, if it's valid, we can simply call form.save, and that will add the book to the database. Now what we need to do here is return a partial containing the form and the div that surrounds the form, as you can see here, this div with the ID of add form container. We need to return that back to the front end to replace the content here. Now what we'd normally do, and I'm going to do this now actually, is we're going to cut that out of the template, and we're going to create a partial template here called form.html. And we can paste that code back in there, and then back in the original template we can use the include template tag to reference this new template which contains our form.html. So this should look the same if we go back to the page here and refresh. We still have the form, but it's now been extracted to a partial template. Now the argument for template fragments is that you don't always want to extract HTML into different templates just so you can render it with HTMX. So we're going to write this code as we would normally if we extracted it to a partial for now, and we're going to change it later on to see how it's done with template fragments. So let's go back to views.py. What we're going to do when it's a post request is we're going to return the render function, pass the request to that, and the template that we're going to use is form.html, and we're going to attach a context to that. So the form.html template, it's the template that contains the div with that ID, and within that div we have the form itself. We want to return that, so we need the form in a context here. Now there's two scenarios, one that the form is valid, in which case we want to return a fresh form for the next submission. So let's create a context variable when the form is valid. We'll call it form, and we can instantiate the book form again. On the other hand, the other scenario is when the form is not valid. In that case, we're going to attach the form key to the form itself that's already been instantiated on line 8 with the post data. We're just going to attach that to the context, and then we'll return the form.html, and that will be swapped in by HTMX. So let's save that and go back to the page. We're going to add a submission here. Let's add a book called Gravity's Rainbow. When we submit that, we obviously don't see anything because we're not listing out the books yet. So that's the next step in this application. We're going to create a list below the add book form to list out all the books in this library. If we go back to VS Code, you see the post request has a 200 response, so it seems to have worked. There's been no errors at least. And what we're going to do now is we're going to add code within our index.html to list out all the existing books in the database. So let's create another HR tag below the form, and below that I'm going to paste some HTML here. We've got a UL tag, and we have a for loop for each book in the database of books. We render out the book's name in an LI tag. So what we need to do now is add books to the context on a GET request. So let's go back to views.py. On line 15, this is what happens in the GET request. We have the book form being added to the context. What we're also going to do is add a key of books, and that's going to be equal to book.objects.all. And this function gives us all of the book rows in the database, and then it adds it to that context so we can reference it. So if we go back to the page, if we refresh this page, we see we have that book below that we added a second ago. So the submission with HTMX is working. What we're now going to do is use django-render-block, this library from GitHub, and we're going to change the setup of this so that we're not using a separate HTML file, but instead we use a template fragment. So let's go back to VS Code, and we can stop the server here. and we're going to paste a command here. It's the pip install django-render-block command. If you execute that, it will bring that library into your virtual environment, and then we can use that within our project. So if we go back to GitHub for a second, what this says in the description of the library, it says it renders the content of a specific block tag from a Django template. So what we're going to do is go back to the index.html template, and we're going to remove the include statement here and bring back the form.html into the original template here. So we've no longer separated the form into its own template, we've brought it back into the parent template. And what we're going to do now is define a Django block, and that block is going to surround the form content. And we're going to call this block add book form. And remember, below the div, we need to end that block there. So once you've closed that off, we now have this block that surrounds the content that we want to return on an HTMX response when the form is submitted. What we're now going to do is go back to our views.py, and we need to modify this because we no longer have a form.html. In fact, I'm going to delete that template here on the left. We now need to reference the content within the block itself. So how do we do that? Let's go back to GitHub, and we can scroll down to see how to use Django-render-block. Now what we do is we define these blocks as we've just done, and then what we have in Django-render-block, there's a function called render-block to string, and you pass to the function the template as a first argument, and the second argument is the name of the block itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this import at the top, the function render block to string, and in the views.py file we're going to import that at the top here. And the only change we need to make in the view itself is we need to change line 15 here. On that line we're using the render function, and we have the form.html template that we've just deleted. So what we're going to do is remove that, and we're going to replace it and create a variable called HTML. And we're going to use that render block to string function, and we're going to pass to that the name of the parent template as a first argument. That's index.html template. And remember, the second argument is the name of the block that we want to render to a string. So let's go back to index.html. We've named the block add book form. So let's copy that and paste it as the second argument to that function. Now when we're rendering that block to a string, you'll notice in the block we have a reference to a form context variable. We can also pass the context through, just like we can with the render function, and that's done with a third argument here. So we pass the context that we've set up on line 12 or 14, and that way this knows how to render the form itself. So that gives us back a string. We need to return a Django HTTP response object with that string attached. So we'll return HTTP response, and we'll pass the HTML to that. Now we need to import HTTP response, so let's go to the top, and we're going to say from django.http import that class there. So now that we've made those changes, let's go back to our page and we can test this out. Let's refresh the page and we'll add a new book. Let's add the book 1984. Now if we refresh this page, we see that it does appear in the list. So this new setup is now working. And the big benefit of this setup is that we no longer need to break apart the HTML files into multiple partials unless we want to. Instead, we have this new alternative method of rendering a particular piece of a template to a string and then returning that as an HTTP response. All we need to do is define a block in our Django template, give the block a name, and that block should contain the code that we want to return and swap into the DOM with HTMX. And once we've done that in our view, we can then use this function here from Django-render-block to actually render that specific block in our template and return that so that HTMX can swap it into the DOM. And just like the normal render function or the render to string function from Django, this can take a context, and that will allow you to render that template block to a string with all the details from any context variables filled in correctly. So that's template fragments in action. The next step in this video, we're going to take this list here, and whenever we add a book to the list, we're actually going to add it below immediately rather than having to refresh the page. And to make this work, we're going to use a custom HTMX event on the submission, and on a successful submission, it's going to add that event to the response. That will then trigger another action on the front end to fetch all the books from the database and fill this list in correctly. And we're going to use Django-render-block to make this work with another block in our template rather than extracting a partial template. So let's go back to our view, and what we're going to do below here when we take this HTML that we get back from the render block to string function, and instead of immediately returning an HTTP response, we're going to create a response variable here, and that will be equal to the return value of this. This will be a response object in Django. And then what we can do with that response object is we can add HTTP headers, and one of those is the HX trigger header, and that allows you to specify an event that you can trigger on your front end on a particular action. So what we're going to do is, if the form is valid, we're going to add an HX trigger header to this response, and we're going to set that equal to an event called book added. Once we've done that, we can then simply return the response as we normally would. So all this is doing is, when we have a valid form submission, in other words when a book is added to the database, we're going to add this HX trigger header, and we're going to set it equal to book added. Now we can go back to our index.html template, and we're going to scroll down to this UL tag. I'm going to add some HTMX attributes to this tag, and we're going to listen for that event. So we're going to say HX trigger equals book added, and that will be from the body. And let's fix this error here. That should be book added. And if you're curious about this from body, we can go to the HTMX documentation. When you trigger an event with that HX trigger header, as it says here, you will likely want to use the from body modifier. So we're going to do that in our template here. So that's the trigger. It uses that custom HX trigger header that we added. And what we want to do on that trigger is we want to send a GET request. And we're going to use, again, the Django URL template tag here. And we're going to create a URL called book list. And finally, we're going to say HX swap equals outer HTML. So what we now need to do is create this URL called book list. So let's go to urls.py, and we're going to create a new path here below, and that's going to link to a book list endpoint. And let's load up a view here called book list. And we need to give it the same name that we used in the URL template tag. So we'll use the name book list here. And we now need to create a view called book list. And the idea of this view is it should return all of the books in the database, and it should return a fragment that can then be swapped into the DOM and replace this UL tag and all of the books below that. So let's go back to views, and we're going to create a new view function here called book list. That'll take the request as an argument. We're going to set up a context here, and it's going to have a key of books, which will link to all of the books in the database. Remember, we want all of the books here so that we can place them into the DOM below. But the question now is, what template do we return? We don't have a partial template. So what we're going to need to do is create another block, as we did up here for the form. We're going to create a block that surrounds this UL tag containing the content we want to return in our HTMX response. So let's create a block, and this time we'll call it book-list. And again, remember to end that block below the UL tag. And now we can go back to our views.py, and below the context we can create again that HTML variable, and we're going to copy the name of this function from django-render-block. I'm going to paste that in here, and again this takes the template as a first argument. That's the index.html template, and the second argument is the name of the block we want to render here, and it's going to be book-list. And finally we'll pass the context to this function as well, and we need this context because if we look at this block that we're rendering, it needs to know about these books. So we're attaching that as a third argument. The context is created here on line 28, and it contains that books key. So we've got that now, and we can simply return an HTTP response with that HTML attached. So again, we're returning a fragment from within this index.html file. It means we can define sections of this file and give them a name, and then reference that in our backend views and return that without having to break things into separate templates. So let's test and see if this works. We'll refresh the page. If we try and add another book, let's say crime and punishment here, if we hit the submit button, we now see that that appears below. So let's finish this video by summarizing the flow here. We have a form that contains some HTMX attributes. When we submit that form, it goes to this view here at the top, this index view. And if the form is valid, it's going to save that book to the database. And then we use the render block to string function from django-render-block to render this particular fragment here containing our form container. And then we replace that form in the DOM. And what the view also does is it sees if the form is valid, and it adds an HX trigger header with an event called book added. And in our index.html file, we have below the form a section for the book list, and the UL tag for that book list has an HX trigger that's set to that custom event called book added. So when we have a valid submission, this UL will then trigger a GET request to our book list view. And that view will then, if we scroll down here, it will get all of the books from the database. It will render that other block that we created here that surrounds the book list. It will render that to a string, and then return that response to be swapped into the DOM. So we're using Django and HTMX for this workflow, and the big benefit is here we have two different HTMX responses, but instead of breaking that out into two separate templates or partials, we can now use blocks within the parent template, the index.html template. Now this is a new approach that can greatly reduce the number of templates in your application, but it doesn't mean you have to do away with partials altogether. You can also separate some of your code where it makes sense into partial templates. That's still a perfectly valid approach as well. But I think this template fragment approach is very useful because often with HTMX and similar technologies, you want to return small pieces of your HTML files, and rather than breaking everything out into a template, this approach allows you to do things in a different way where you just define the blocks and you don't need to break everything apart. This is definitely something I will be using in the future, and I think this is an interesting approach, and it's the first time personally that I've heard of this template fragment approach, but I think it's very useful for HTMX and similar libraries. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.